Do you feel horrible, and yet you've still been told that you have normal cortisol levels? I've seen this story time and time again, and it looks like this. Maybe you've gone into your doctor's office complaining of weight gain, water retention, mood changes. Maybe it's anxiety or depression or both. Maybe you're noticing some changes in your hair, your nails, your thyroid function, your sexuality, or your gut function. All of these different symptoms could be attributable to changes in your cortisol handling. But what typically happens is that a conventionally trained doctor simply obtains a serum cortisol test. And as I've mentioned in other shorts, you can go look on my channel for these. A serum cortisol study is not going to give you the insight that you need to understand how cortisol could be a strong contributor to all of these symptoms. I'm Scott Resnick. I'm a medical doctor who believes that the future of medicine is in individuals like you learning about your health and turning around all aspects of your health without using drugs. And today we're talking about the 4-part salivary cortisol test. Over the course of this video, what I want to do first is do a quick review of what cortisol is and why it's important. And then from there, what we'll do is we'll look at the 4-part salivary cortisol test. Now, this is unquestionably the best way to understand what's going on with cortisol handling in your body. And by the end of this video, you're going to have an understanding of what this test is measuring. And I'm going to go over about 4 different representative patterns. So you can go and grab your salivary cortisol test, join this video, and let's help you to figure out exactly where you are. Now, if I've said this before, I will say it again. Cortisol is the king of our hormones, and all of the body's anatomical processes and all of our other hormones bow down to cortisol's signals. Why is this? Now, many of us think of cortisol as our primary stress hormone, and this is true. But to an ancestral human who's simply trying to stay alive, a stressor is not a cell phone that's dying or a traffic jam. A true human stressor is not being able to find enough food. And cortisol's primary job is to increase the amount of glucose that's in our bloodstream. And what it does is it negotiates with all of the other hormones in our bodies so that this is the most important thing that is happening. Because if we're not maintaining blood glucose in our bloodstream, we're not able to keep our heart and our brain alive. Cortisol is the king of hormones, and it lords over all of our other hormonal systems. Now, the problem with conventional medicine is that typically we only measure a single serum cortisol test, and this isn't giving us the information that we need because cortisol changes over the course of the day. Cortisol is a diurnal hormone, and if you look at some typical cortisol patterning, cortisol rises up while we sleep to about 7 times the level of what it is over the course of the day when we're awake. And this makes sense if you go back to recall that cortisol's job is to maintain our body's blood sugar, because when we're asleep, we can't be eating food. So what happens is as we sleep, our cortisol rises and it instructs our body to break down some of the storage places that we have for glucose, such as glycogen or amino acids in our muscles, to make glucose to keep our brain and heart alive while we are sleeping. Now, what is so interesting to me is that having looked at thousands of studies, is I've recognized that there is a pattern that transpires over the course of what possibly months to years, whereby cortisol becomes more dysfunctional. And when you understand these patterns, and this is what I'm going to go over in this video, you're going to have a better understanding of not only where you stand on the cortisol dysfunction spectrum, but you're going to have some opportunities and some tools to really get a hold of the steps that you need to take so that your cortisol gets better. And all of those symptoms that I was talking about at the beginning of this video are going to improve as well. A 4-part salivary cortisol test measures the free unbound cortisol which is present in the saliva. And this is kind of cool because when our salivary glands make saliva, they pretty much approximate what's going on at the capillary levels in our tissues. I can contrast this with a serum cortisol test, which looks at the free hormone which is available to our cells, but also the bound cortisol, which is bound in a protein known as cortisol binding globulin. The first thing that I want to do is go over a normal cortisol test. As you can see from this diagram, cortisol rises up in the wee hours of the morning, peaking somewhere between like maybe 3 and 6 o'clock in the morning. Then it comes down over the course of the day. And when you're looking at a 4-part salivary cortisol test, typically there is a normal range, which is designated by effectively what would be a bell-shaped curve. Now, I can tell you that there are very few people whose cortisol curve goes precisely in the middle of the normal range. So as you're looking at your cortisol curve, expect to see some variation. But what we're looking for are some of the variations that I'll be discussing that are really falling outside of this normal range. And typically these can be associated with your symptoms. When you understand where your cortisol levels stand, then you can begin to take the steps to fix your cortisol. As I mentioned, the first cortisol study that I'm looking at here is a normal cortisol test. And you can see that cortisol rises up in the morning and then comes down over the course of the day. In this example, the 4 salivary samples that were taken over the course of the day are all in the normal range of the test. What happens is, as we get into a more acute stressor, and this was written about by a near Nobel Prize winning doctor named Hans Selye in the 1930s. What happens at first is we get into a high cortisol and a high DHEAS state. So if you have a cortisol curve that looks like this curve that I'm showing you now, and you have high DHEAS, this is suggestive that you are in an earlier stage of a cortisol dysfunction. And now, this high amount of cortisol is probably increasing your anxiety, increasing your blood pressure and pulse, increasing the amount of water retention in your body, and increasing some degree of depression and mood changes as well. The next graph that I'm showing you here is what we begin to see when our cortisol begins to change. Now, typically the cortisol is high or normal, but the first thing that we see as we begin to develop a more exaggerated degree of cortisol dysfunction is a high or normal cortisol and a low DHEAS. DHEAS is basically the headwater hormone of all of our anabolic tissue building and repairing hormones. What happens is, as we get into places of prolonged stress, we move away from building tissues and more towards a state of breaking down tissues. Remember, that's what cortisol does to keep our blood sugar elevated. As we develop a more pronounced and progressive dysfunction in cortisol, we see a high or normal cortisol with a low DHEAS. Now, the next progression that I'm showing you here, you'll see that the morning cortisol level, this is the early morning rise, starts to become suppressed. And don't be surprised if even with the suppressed morning cortisol that you're still able to raise your cortisol sometime over the course of the day. This is a suggestion that you are moving into a more progressive state of cortisol dysfunction. And again, here the DHEAS can be normal, but typically it is beginning to trend into the lower ranges of normal. And one of the important patterns I want you to look for here is an evening rise in the cortisol. I can't tell you how many patients I have met with who said, "Doc, I am exhausted all day long. And then, man, after dinner, before bed, it feels like I'm awake and I'm ready to start vacuuming the house." Don't be surprised to see if this corresponds with an increase of your evening cortisol levels like I'm showing in this graph here. And the last and the most significant and really most difficult cortisol patterning is when we start to see what is known as a flatline cortisol. Typically, this is in association with low DHEAS, and what you'll basically see is a flattening of your cortisol over the course of the day. Now, typically in terms of symptoms, this represents a more pronounced state of cortisol dysfunction, and people are bone tired. They can't get out of bed. They're looking around the office for snacks mid-morning or mid-afternoon. They're feeling like they need to take a nap in the afternoon, and they're just exhausted. And don't be surprised if, in spite of this flattened cortisol curve, you find yourself waking up like a shot at 3 to 4 in the morning. This is because to compensate for the low cortisol overnight, your body is reaching to adrenaline. And adrenaline is our backup hormone that helps us to maintain our blood sugar when our cortisol isn't working well. There you have 4 pretty characteristic patterns that in my 15 years of doing functional medicine, I have seen over and over again. Now, don't be surprised if your cortisol curve looks a little different. Maybe you've got a mid-afternoon spike in your cortisol that might correspond with the gym workout that you went to on that particular day. Maybe you notice that your DHEA and cortisol aren't moving as I described. Again, this doesn't necessarily apply to everybody, but cortisol is so important. And if you want to know how cortisol fits into the overall working of your body, it's important to think about cortisol in regard to what I refer to as the health systems pyramid. Now, this is a paradigm that I've developed over the years that I will be explaining on this channel. But it's important to recognize that if you really want to know what your cortisol is doing, you can't look at it in a vacuum. You need to be looking at your cortisol in concert with your insulin and your thyroid hormones. These in the health systems pyramid make up the foundational second layer, second strata, which is how our body manages energy. And just to simplify things, if cortisol raises our blood sugar, insulin lowers our blood sugar, and we have thyroid hormone as a thermostat. So when times are tough and we're having a hard time finding food, we can dial back our metabolism so that the calories that we've saved on our bones last a little longer. Now, if you're still with this video, it's because you want to know the steps that you can take to begin to get well. And what I've done is I've constructed what I refer to as my functional health assessment. And this is an at-home, self-guided, comprehensive, simple assessment of your health that can be made with some simple tools that you will find lying around your house. If you want to look at your health assessment and get a sense of where you stand on the spectrum of disease to really being healthy, I'd encourage you to go into the description, click on the link, and take your assessment. And let me know how you do with that. And as always, be sure to like, comment, subscribe. That helps me to understand whether these videos are helping you and the topics that you want to hear about in future videos. Cortisol is the king of hormones. Be sure that you measure it correctly. It's going to give you a window into so many of your symptoms, because once your cortisol is under control, everything else falls into place. All right, guys, I'll see you in another video, and take care.